Massachusetts in 1992, continuing her critical analysis of AIDS education policy. She joined the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at SFU in May of 2003 as Canada Research Chair in Community, Culture, and Health, where she continues to work on a range of community-engaged research projects. Her recent works have explored gay men's and straight women's experience of HIV-related lipodystrophy, home care for homeless people with HIV, and aging with HIV. She's currently collaborating with Positive Living and St. Paul's Hospital to document the work of the new HIV peer navigators. Her newest work is in the area of bioethics and HIV, including the work she presents today on the treatment as prevention approach and forthcoming work on the ethics of the pre-exposure prophylaxis trials and their policy implications. Please welcome Dr. Cindy Patton.
As Barry was talking about different forms of science that have been put forward in favor of and against the treatment as prevention approach, I was thinking that we actually here never got to hear the counter story. So I think it's important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but our papers, I think, fit nicely together because Barry's really set up well an understanding of, from within the research domain, what part of the data we've heard and what part has been completely left out. As often happens when Barry and I speak together, he's very calm and rational, and I tend to get a little excited. So I've written my paper out, and I'm going to try to perform it to the best of my ability. But I've also got a longer version. I'm going to necessarily gloss over some of the more nuanced steps in the argument that I want to make about research policy, ethics, and human rights. In the months leading up to the 18th International AIDS Conference held in Vienna in July 2010, and through that year's International AIDS Day, politicians, researchers, and reporters increased their use of rights language to describe solutions to the AIDS epidemic. Indeed, the very name of the 18th Annual Conference, Rights Here, Right Now, suggested that a line had been drawn in the sand concerning the civil and legal plight of those who were subject to HIV. Resonating with slogans and street protests from the early AIDS activist movement, the reportage was laced with phrases that underscored a sense of urgency about conveying rights as a mechanism for combating a global disease. But what is the nature of the rights that were on offer, and to whom would they be given? I'll try to show in the analysis that follows that there are in fact two irreconcilable conceptualizations of rights that are implicit or explicit in the current shifts in AIDS policy. And these are specifically related to the propositions about the role of HIV medication, that is treatment, in the global epidemic. These two concepts of rights are used to support quite different approaches to managing both the local and global HIV epidemic. The established approach is articulated at the highest level of the World Health Organization. Director General Margaret Chan developed this long-standing understanding of rights and health in her 2010 World AIDS Day statement, where she said, "Health, HIV, and human rights are inextricably linked. HIV responses need to ensure that human rights are protected and promoted. At the same time, the promotion of protection and human rights reduces HIV risk and vulnerability and makes HIV programs more effective. Those populations most vulnerable and at risk of HIV are the same populations prone to human rights violations. HIV policies and programs in the health sector must promote human rights and empower individuals to exercise those rights. People living with AIDS should not only enjoy the right to health, but also their right to access social services such as education, employment, housing, social security, and asylum." Okay, incompatible with this hard-won and nearly 3-decade-old understanding of health and human rights is a newly minted rubric of treatment as prevention. While the concept itself is by no means new in population health approaches to disease, its implementation in the context of HIV is widely promoted as a new paradigm, especially here in British Columbia with our homegrown Seek and Treat program. The press releases about this program and the single modeling paper published in an academic journal uses language that is based in the logic of population health to argue for the superiority of Seek and Treat over the existing rights-conscious, risk-based approaches to prevention and access to care, the approach that's been the global standard for more than a decade. The architects of Seek and Treat make no link with the decades of international debate about the range of rights that are explicitly embedded in the World Health Organization's 3x5 program implementation, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay. Instead, the language of Seek and Treat and prevention, treatment as prevention in general, uses epidemiologic concepts instead of rights concepts. So population substitutes for humanity, and the at-risk group rubric reemerges in place of notions of minority citizenship. Despite the massive local, national, and international publicity about Seek and Treat, the modeling paper called Expanding Access to Heart, a Cost-Effective approach for Treating and Preventing HIV gives a rather different impression of the goals of the program. And it says, HIV continues to present a substantial global health burden. Given the high direct medical costs associated with the disease, prevention of new transmission is an important element in limiting economic burden. In addition to providing therapeutic benefit, treatment with heart has the potential to prevent transmission of HIV. The objective in this study was to perform an economic evaluation of the incremental net benefit associated with an intervention to expand treatment with heart in British Columbia. Over 30 years, the heart expansion scenario was associated with a benefit of $90 million. Therefore, increasing the heart treatment from 50 to 75% in British Columbia appears to be a cost-effective strategy. The dehumanizing language in which persons living with AIDS are potential transmission points associated with cost units is not salvaged by the researchers' limited view of rights as merely questions of vulnerability, consent, and voluntary participation. In their one other published article, instead of assessing the impact of colonialism, homophobia, and drug policy, issues widely explored in the social science research since the 1980s, the researchers paint the dispossessed as irrational. Quote, there are tremendous challenges associated with the Seek and Treat initiative, given that a substantial number of individuals eligible for treatment will come from the pool of those marginalized and not engaged in care. Heart expansion based on the 2008 ISA-USA guidelines will therefore require development of sustained and intensified strategies to identify HIV-infected individuals and those at risk, helping them to stabilize their lives and facilitate their sustained engagement in appropriate health care. All of this within a voluntary and fully consented framework. If citations in an academic article are any indication of what literature researchers have explored, then the modeling team appears to ignore the volumes of social science research exploring how prevention works in practice, not to mention ignoring the wealth of films, plays, novels, periodicals, and personal writings that clearly and loudly articulate the views of persons living with HIV on questions of access and rights. And of course, many scientists are themselves skeptical about the treatment as prevention approach. Some argue that the models do not accurately reflect actual behavior, including the ability to maintain drug regimens. Others question the feasibility of mass voluntary testing programs. Yet others argue that the model is not falsifiable because of the extreme differences between measuring behavioral and biomedical outcomes, or because the projected time of success of the model is between 5 and 50 years in the future. So in practical terms, implementing pilot programs based on the model essentially creates a new prevention and care regime. That is, it's a policy decision. And I want to note that it's because of this lack of scientific consensus on the treatment as prevention approach that in the United States, the testing and linkage to care, which is the same thing as Seek and Treat, on paper anyway, was implemented not as a policy but as a research study. Therefore, its protocols and all of the consent forms are publicly available. And in addition, it received ethics review. Unlike Seek and Treat, which was implemented as policy by fiat, there are, of course, various subsidiary pieces of evaluation research, most all of which began after the program was well in place. Thus, I think it's safe to say that in British Columbia now, we're undergoing a massive, undeclared research project with no or unclear baseline data, and no ethics review, not to mention no independent data monitoring, which would be required if this had been set up as a proper clinical trial. So, how do we get to this kind of situation where there's such violent disagreements about policy? So, like Barry, I'm going to go back in history a little bit. This is something that some of you are going to recognize. It's called the rights of people with AIDS. 1, to live as full, satisfying sexual and emotional lives as anyone else. To receive quality medical treatment and quality social service provision without discrimination of any form, including sexual orientation, gender, diagnosis, economic status, or race. To obtain full explanation of all medical procedures and risks. To choose or refuse their treatment modalities. To refuse to participate in research without jeopardizing their treatment, and to make informed decisions about their lives. To ensure privacy and confidentiality of medical records, to receive human respect and the right to choose who their significant others are, to die and to live in dignity. That sounds very futuristic, but it comes from the 1983 Denver Principles from the People Living with AIDS Self-Empowerment Movement. So smack dab in the middle of the 1980s, in what the media called the gay plague, were young gay activists witnessing illness and death among friends and lovers. They perceived negative or ineffectual social and government responses to AIDS as a generalized attack on their fledgling community. In the face of right-wing proclamations that AIDS was God's revenge for the gay lifestyle, gay liberationists found it increasingly difficult to get political traction for their ideals of sexual freedom. But an early pamphlet, published about 2 months after the NAPWA Declaration, offered a disease prevention strategy that was not yet but would soon be called safe sex. And this will also, for those of you who are old enough, you'll remember this one. What began as sexual freedom has become a tyranny of sexually transmitted diseases. Finding ways to have sex and avoid these epidemics might seem impossible, but we believe it's not. This pamphlet offers one means of reducing and hopefully eliminating risk, which has yet to receive proper attention. Limiting what sex acts you choose to perform to ones that interrupt disease transmission. The key to this approach is modifying what you do, not how often you do it or with how many partners. Our challenge is to figure out how we can have gay, life-affirming sex, satisfy our emotional needs, and stay alive. And that's from the Callan and Berkowitz, How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, also from 1983. So this general philosophy, though it seems really radical now, became the backbone of the community-generated safe sex campaigns that Barry was talking about, as opposed to the later, quite individualistic campaigns that were co-sponsored by public health agencies. But almost the moment that witnessing illness as a form of attempting to sustain meaningful life began, the Helms Amendment came out in 1987. The Helms Amendment in the U.S. denied federal funding to any organization or group that promoted promiscuity or homosexuality. And this resulted in a long battle over what forms of educational messages were possible. And it was a form of censorship that the U.S. added to all of its international AIDS packages. And it's a historical moment that haunts safe sex work today. This vilification of gay sex placed whole communities under attack. Gay men were fired or suspended from their jobs because their employers linked homosexuality to AIDS. With few state or municipal protections for sexual minorities, and none on the federal level, advocates began scrambling to get a foothold against the discrimination that was circulating around AIDS. The legal advocates in the 80s then turned to the emerging body of disability law, which in the United States was codified in 1990 in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this became sort of the activist paradigm for coping with a wide range of forms of discrimination. The turn to disability law was a critical milestone in creating enforceable rights for people living with AIDS. But it worked only insofar as AIDS remained a stigmatized disease with a clear-cut link between diagnosis and disability. When treatments eventually enabled many to live with HIV as a chronic and remitting disease, the disability law actually made it difficult to access disability benefits. As a result, there had to be a lot of additional legal activity to determine when disability law applied and when it didn't. The awkward social linkage between HIV as a disability and homosexuality as a disease created a whole new form of homophobia. Because there were still almost no protections for lesbians and gay men as such, and because hate crimes statutes were rarely enforced, the forms of social hatred and the lack of freedom that had been analyzed by gay liberationists for a couple of decades remained in place. So when the new millennium dawned, the generalized idea of a right for a person with AIDS was largely accepted in democratic countries and widely incorporated into the language of any kind of international health activity. But these rights depended on the enforceability of disability or health care law. In some locations, persons with AIDS were no longer burdened by having to perpetually demand their rights. They had the right to care and the freedom from various forms of discrimination based on their HIV status. But almost no countries made legal changes explicitly to address the questions of discrimination and stigmatization based in gender, sexual orientation, or ethnicity that might have combated the social patterns that underlie HIV infection and poor prognosis. Paradoxically, in establishing enforceable rights in the law by using disability law, the political indictment of the larger structural wrongs kind of slipped out of view. So when this occurred, when this sort of split between a very narrow idea of rights related only to HIV as a disability split off from this kind of larger sense of human rights related to sexual orientation, gender, and these other underlying structural issues occurred, scientists and politicians began to be able to bemoan the plight of people living with HIV, narrowly construed, but without pointing to any of the specific government policies as the cause of the larger structural harms that placed people at risk. And they began to speak in terms of, instead of using the legal concept of humanity in relationship to rights, they began to use the epidemiologic concept of population in relationship to rights. This might seem like a really small detail, but there's a recent article, a recent paper in a peer-reviewed journal that argues that populations have rights and that as such, human rights law should be applied to HIV-positive persons who do not comply with safe sex advice. In other words, they shouldn't be charged merely with reckless endangerment or whatever minor legal remedies are available now, but rather such a person should be charged with a human rights violation. I'm just going to skip a couple of things here. I'll just leave this point aside, but I just want to make a really quick contrast between the 3x5 program and the treatment as prevention approach. And this is sort of articulated in the longer paper. And this is a complex, how treatment as prevention will shift within the context of World Health Organization is still complicated. But it's important to understand that the 3x5 program, however slow and problematic, was built through a kind of intersectoral consensus, if not a democratic process. And when the 3x5 ramping up treatment in low and middle income countries initiative occurred, there were many, many, many long-standing AIDS organizations involved. Lots of people with AIDS were consulted. And there was a huge concern that in ramping up universal access to care, people would stop doing prevention work. And so there's an initiative within 3x5 which also scales up prevention work, prevention as we've seen it before. So in 3x5 you have a parallel path of treatment in order to provide care and prevention in order to provide prevention, not lumping the two together. So what we're witnessing now is a kind of troubling shift in what had been a consensus around how to do HIV care and HIV prevention that was crafted by many, many, many countries, many non-government organizations, and in conjunction with all of the work to lower cost of drugs by intervening with the pharmaceutical companies and the international trade agreements that govern what counts as intellectual property and what can be produced. Almost 30 years ago, the suffering bodies of persons with AIDS demanded that the structures of power recognize them as full persons. They bore witness to the ongoing wrongs to which they were subject. Because it was and remains necessary to work within the laws of specific nations, the literally fatal social stigma and indignity they spoke of continue. Universal access to care and not mandatory treatment, and strong support for community self-determination and not blanket use of drugs for prevention has been the consensus route forward for more than a decade, but it's being challenged very recently. Treatment as prevention programs require testing and mandatory treatment on a scale seen only in dictatorships. Even if carefully constructed press campaigns, and I realized that last night the local Go Out and Get Yourself Tested campaign came on the web. You should all have a look at it. Even if these carefully constructed press campaigns convince vast numbers of people to voluntarily submit to testing and, if they find themselves positive, undergo lifelong treatment, this success will be at the cost of a very important consensus about the larger, more robust understanding of rights. In the uncanny moment of the shock and awe of statistical modeling that cloaks itself in the ethos of rights, how can we remain attentive to the wrongs that are occurring to the individuals who are the targets of these programs? Even if it's popular for everyone to throw around the term rights, rights only take on meaning relationally. And most of all, they have meaning for those who can claim them. We must ground our ethic in the recognition that the supposed right to be free from AIDS at the level of population does not scale down equally to all members of society. A population cannot be meaningfully said to suffer, and yet contemporary calls for better global citizenship are founded on the articulation of individual human suffering. Any population-level plan that fails to scale down and improve individual lives should not be allowed to speak on our behalf. This disconnect between the population-level language and research that Barry's talked so well about and what happens on the local level, in this disconnect between those two, we should realize that there's something wrong, even if we don't have the power to speak back to science. We should never allow costing arguments to cloak themselves in the language of compassion. Implementation of programs certainly require money, but more than money, health programs at the global and the local level require political consensus. We should never allow wrongs to be enumerated in financial terms. Justice is justice regardless of the price. And when we find ourselves numbered among the beneficiaries of a population health intervention, we should look very, very closely and understand who it is among us who will carry the largest burden for ensuring the safety of a population from which those burdened will have an effect to be excluded. Is that happening here?